Please be seated and welcome to the White House. I am delighted you could join us this afternoon to hear even more about one of the remarkable women in our history who lived here and worked here on behalf of causes and issues that she believed would advance the common good. To most Americans, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis is a mystique, wrought from enchanting photographs and news footage. A beautiful young woman adorning a Life magazine cover, an elegant guide who took us on a television tour of this great national treasure, a brave widow. But as with most public figures, she was no one that we, the public, ever really gets to know. I was privileged to know her in the last years of her life, when she became one of my husband's earliest supporters. I am grateful for the time we spent together and for her wisdom and good advice and friendship. In his new book, As We Remember Her, Carl Anthony explains Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, the human being, through the recollections, anecdotes, and stories of those closest to her. We see her not only as First Lady, but as mother, daughter, daughter-in-law, preservationist, integrationist, campaigner, colleague, student, diplomat, and friend. One of my favorite quotes in the book, as you might guess, came from Eleanor Roosevelt, who said of the future First Lady, and told me again just the other day, "There is a great deal more to her than meets the eye. I know she'll do very well." And very well she did, indeed, but I will leave that to Carl to tell. Carl Anthony is recognized as one of our nation's leading experts on the women who have lived in the White House, the First Ladies, and their social, popular, cultural, and political context in presidential history. He is the author of the two-volume First Ladies, the Saga of the President's Wives and Their Power, 1789 to 1990, and he has served as a historical consultant to the Smithsonian's newly conceptualized exhibit on First Ladies. He has also served as a speechwriter to Nancy Reagan and consultant to the White House Preservation Fund. I've had the personal pleasure of being interviewed by Carl as part of his 4-month George Washington University symposium, The President's Spouse, where all the living First Ladies appeared for Carl to question in front of a very large audience. And last week, again, at the Kentucky Authors Forum in Louisville, Kentucky, Carl was asked to interview me about my book. He's a popular lecturer, writer, and television news commentator. And I look forward not only to reading this book about Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, although I have to confess I've already read it in galleys, but to see it in the final print, but also to his upcoming book, Duchess, about the life of the powerful and progressive Florence Harding. One of the reasons why I'm delighted you could join us to hear from Carl about this new book and about his research into Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis is that ever since I've been privileged to live here in this wonderful house, I have learned a great deal about my predecessors, and they were things I had never learned in history nor ever read in the press before arriving. And I have learned that many of them had walked the path of reformer and activist and agitator and citizen long before the 20th century, and certainly long before I arrived. I was also somewhat amused when the Smithsonian changed their very popular First Ladies exhibit with the gowns, which has been the historic draw for tourists from all over the world, to reflect more fairly and broadly the many contributions that the women who've lived here have made to our country, talking about their contributions to politics, to causes of their time, to history, and to other issues that they had a passion about. And I was surprised to learn that when the exhibit changed to reflect the much more accurate, broader view of these women, the Smithsonian received a spate of critical letters and inquiries from people who were incensed that the Smithsonian was acting politically correctly in attempting to make these women relevant. I took that very personally, as you might guess, because I think they were relevant, all in their own ways. And it gives me a lot of comfort, as you might suppose, when I hear about many of the trials and tribulations these women went through. Starting from the very beginning, when President Washington went to the Congress to ask for a salary for Martha because she did so much in order to help the country. That was not well received. And then Dolly Madison, one of my favorites, who, as I tell everyone who comes to the East Room, saved this marvelous portrait of George Washington from the British when they burned the house in 1814. And not only that, proceeded to sit down and eat the meal she had prepared for her husband and his officers. I thought that was really tacky beyond any conquering prerogative. But she was also, may I say, investigated by Congress as well. So there's a lot of history that we just don't have that has been lost because everyone is so intent upon putting these women into a particular mold. The mold changes perhaps from decade to decade and time to time, but if there is anything that she has done that doesn't fit the mold, or on her own account, those who are advising her husband, as well as the forces of history and popular journalism, attempt to make sure that nothing spills over the sides of the preconceived mold. Well, Carl Anthony has opened a lot of these molds to much closer examination, and I think to a much better sense of the complexity and the interest that these women should be provoking in all of us. So now I invite Carl Anthony, a historian, a storyteller, an expert on an issue near and dear to my heart, and my friend, to join me here at the podium and to address all of you about his marvelous work on behalf of all of us in remembering Jackie Kennedy Onassis. Carl?
I think I might start by paraphrasing, actually taking a quote Robert Frost said in 1962 in reference to Jacqueline Kennedy and apply it to our current First Lady. There have been some great wives in the White House like Abigail Adams and Dolly Madison, so great that you can't think of their husbands, presidents, without thinking of them. It looks as though we are having another one now. But Jacqueline Kennedy, too, endured her share of criticism from the inane questioning of whether she should be taking vacations in Europe because of it affected the balance of payment problems. Her hairstyle was constantly under examination, and sometimes there were even illustrated drawings in the newspaper of how she had changed it. One of the most peculiar criticisms was of her wearing a bathing suit when she went water skiing with then astronaut John Glenn, of course, which begs the question as to what the press expected her to wear while water skiing. And I think having gone through this experience of perhaps being pigeonholed early on and lived not only during her White House years but long afterwards with that kind of the same kind of assumptions perhaps being made about her in the press, she was very excited, I know, when Mrs. Clinton came to this role. And when there was some of the criticism that was beginning of Mrs. Clinton's choices in activism, Jackie got very upset. She said, "I don't know what the problem is. America is getting a bargain with her. Hillary Clinton is worth at least 2 Helen of Troys." That was, I think, that remark in some way very revealing, because Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis lived with history, not just the history that fate had thrust her into, but going about her own modern-day, everyday life with a sense of what you might call historical consciousness of the people and the events who had preceded her and all of us in different situations, whether it be wartime or depression, or a country going through the shock of an assassination. She had what I like to call almost a timeless quality, because she didn't use history in the traditional sense that one would imagine as a historian or as a writer or someone conducting research. She used bits and pieces of it to evoke something of the enduring human spirit in all of us, the things that bind us back 100 and 200 years ago. She did this in her jokes. She did this in the books she liked to edit. She did this in her winning Vogue Prix de Paris contest when she used nostalgia as the theme of a blueprint for an entire Vogue magazine issue, which was part of the requirement for that contest. And she even used it in writing the introduction to a book that was called Atget's Gardens, the photography of Eugene Atget, earlier in this century, French photographer who captured a lot of the decaying and sort of now lost parks and buildings of royal France. And she wrote in what I think was some of her most beautiful prose, but I think in some ways in this quote you get a sense of what Jackie was always trying to do with history, trying to make sense of it. As we look at the iconography, she wrote, of architecture, sculpture, and fountains recorded by the honesty of Atget's vision, the ancient mysteries of the places return to haunt us. His passionate persistence was echoed a half-century later by Georges Duhamel at the Académie Française. In the present disorder of the world, to conserve is to create. We find these photographs troubling because we can connect to them. Our grandfathers sit in black serge suits along the paths laid out by kings and queens. Jacqueline Bouvier first came to this house at the age of 11 years old during the Roosevelt years, when her mother took her and her sister for their first visit to Washington. And she said in 1987, in recalling that visit, "I felt strangely let down by the White House. It seemed rather bleak. There was nothing in the way of a booklet to take away, nothing to teach one more about that great house and those who lived there." It was also on that visit I learned from her very devoted brother, stepbrother, but really brother in spirit, Yusha Auchincloss, who is here with us today, that they visited Arlington Cemetery. And while visiting, just this visit occurring just after World War II had broken out, she wondering aloud to him whether there would be people there someday that would be laid to rest. And she looked out at the vista from the cemetery onto the Capitol and the Washington Monument, and decided that it was the most beautiful sight, all that she had seen on that trip to Washington. At the age of 16 years old, she wrote to him when President Roosevelt died, "I'm still so dazed. I don't know what to do. Isn't it awful about the president? I'm so worried about what will happen now that Roosevelt is dead. I think he was really great. Do write and tell me that everything won't be so bad. I feel sorry most for poor Mrs. Roosevelt. It will be awfully hard for her to leave the White House after all those years." There were no signs particularly that Jackie would pursue a life herself in career or in any of the professional outlets that a history degree might have provided her with, teaching, for example, or any kind of professional or scholarly writing. Yet she did single-mindedly pursue the craft of writing, since, in fact, the age of 5 years old, when she began writing poetry and short stories. Her first book actually was a short story about two family pets, two dogs, who, because they were of a different breed, and despite the fact that they were deeply in love, society would not permit them to marry. I think she got this great sense of history and this real striving for perfection, this striving always to do her best, knowing that she could constantly rework and re-edit and turn out the best phrase and really sculpt images with words. She got these from, I think, the two men who were in some way, surprisingly, her role models, the men she looked up to, and they were her two grandfathers. James Lee, the grandson of Irish immigrants who grew up in the Lower East Side of New York, was the embodiment of the American dream. He worked his way through the public school system, then City College, then Columbia University, where he received his law degree, business degree. He became one of the city's most prominent developers, and he valued highly education. And in discussing him with another cousin, Mimi Lee Cecil, she talked about how their grandfather was sort of dazed by the idea of these young women deciding to pursue higher education. But once they had decided to do it, he egged them on constantly to work and give their greatest to it. The other grandfather, John Verneau Bouvier, was the great-grandson of a French cabinet maker who came to this country about 1815. And he was a famous trial lawyer, an eloquent speaker whose orations around the country were in great demand. And even though he and Jackie only lived 2 or 3 blocks away, they began a correspondence. And this is a really magnificent, quite unbelievable correspondence, beginning approximately when she was 6 years old and continuing until his death in 1948. In fact, one of the most moving stories that she wrote was her first experience with death, and that was the loss of her grandfather, Bouvier. In high school, she was an editor of the school newspaper. She even drew her own cartoon column called Frenzied Frida, loosely based on her own life. In college, she wrote exquisite short stories, one of which is published in the book simply called In Florence, a wonderful, really almost sensuously written, sculpted story of a wonderful night out in Florence, Italy. Although she won the Prix de Paris contest out of 1,280 applicants from 225 colleges around the country, she was persuaded by her mother to turn down the job. The prize was the opportunity to work as a Vogue magazine editor, 6 months in Paris, 6 months in New York. And her mother was also afraid, as was Jackie, that if she returned to Paris, where she had spent a semester in school, which, by the way, with her sense of history, besides visiting all the museums and the magnificent cathedrals, she also visited the Dachau concentration camp, which had only been liberated a few years before that. She feared that if she went back to Europe again, that she might live there. Instead, she got a job as the inquiring camera girl for the Washington Times-Herald. And she ended up turning this rather bland and mundane column into a true Jackie Bouvier adventure. Imagine you're on your lunch break on the streets of Washington when a young brunette woman carrying a clumsy Graflex camera stops you in your tracks and says, "Do you consider yourself normal?" Or, "You look important. Are you? Would you like to be famous? What prominent person's death affected you the most? What is the greatest need in the world today? What are you living for? Do you think hope ever dies? If you could be reincarnated, who would you be? Should a wife let her husband think he's smarter than her? Chaucer said that women most desire power over men. What do you think? When did you discover that women are not the weaker sex? And what do you think of wrestling as a sport for women? She also had a rather decided focus, because in the evenings, back at the home of her mother and stepfather, Marywood in Virginia, she was sort of moonlighting. Jackie was, in fact, working on a script for a history documentary about the Octagon House and James and Dolly Madison's life there. The young reporter who had first come to this house at the age of 11 hadn't lost her fascination with the White House, the presidents, and first ladies. And now she stood outside the gates right here at the northeast entrance and waited as people left, asking them, "Which first lady would you like to have been? What's it like meeting the first lady? What did you like about the White House? What are your memories of presidents? Would you like your son to grow up to be president? What are some of the things people don't know about Lincoln's assassination? Do you think the First Lady's hairstyle will become a national fad?" About this time, she wrote a letter to Bess Furman, a New York Times reporter who covered the White House, and talked about how someday she wanted to write a special book about the White House, to give children inspiration, to give them heroes and heroines to look up to come to know this house as the nation's house. And another kind of question was cropping up in Miss Bouvier's column, decidedly political ones. Stevenson says we have a one-party press. Do you agree? What do you think Truman's place will be in history? Truman ordered the Tidewater oil areas set aside as Navy reserves. Should they be held for national defense? Would you support a woman for president? Do you approve of Ike naming 2 women to his cabinet? Should Charles Wilson be confirmed as defense secretary while holding $2.5 million worth of General Motors stock? Should Eisenhower confer with MacArthur before going to Korea? Will Indochina turn into another Korea? What Americans would you name to the UN to match Russia's Vyshinsky, Gromyko, Zorinand, and Zarubin? Decidedly not the kind of questions people have long assumed Jacqueline Kennedy asked as a reporter. At the time, she had begun a courtship, a sort of cat-and-mouse courtship, with a young congressman from Massachusetts who was then planning his first campaign for the United States Senate, John F. Kennedy. He was elected in 1952, and in the spring of 1953, made his proposal to Jackie. She was covering the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, one of her first full-length reporting stories in which she got a byline, when she had to make this decision. And she was there with her friend, Aileen Bowden, who I believe is here with us this afternoon, and was going back and forth deciding. There was no question, certainly in my mind, certainly from everything I've read, that Jackie Bouvier was deeply, wildly, madly in love with Jack Kennedy. It was not that. It was the question of choices that she had to make, the choice of a traditional one, becoming a wife and mother, and a political one with further obligations at that, or to pursue, to continue her writing. This was evidently a slight bone of contention between the bride and groom when she said her dream, her goal was to write the great American novel. And he, of course, who had written Why England Slept, said, "Jackie, one writer in the family is enough." Not for another 22 years would she write a reporting piece that had nothing to do with her or her life or her husband's. And instead of writing the great American novel, she lived it. Politics. Entering the world immediately as a Senate wife of politics, she rather threw herself into assisting her husband where she felt she could best aid him. She assisted in some constituency mail. She translated French books on Vietnam for him. She served as a bridge to Adlai Stevenson, of whom she was very fond. She edited, and when I say edited, she didn't take pen to paper as an editor, but she certainly reviewed and helped give focus and shape to Profiles in Courage. In fact, Senator Kennedy dedicated the book to her and said that he could, quote, never adequately acknowledge the assistance and criticisms Jackie provided, and that the book would not have been possible without her. She also began learning about things like the African independence movement as she sat listening to African Subcommittee hearings of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which Senator Kennedy chaired. In politics, she became decidedly liberal. As she said at the time, "I was raised a Republican, but you have to be a Republican to know how good it feels to be a Democrat." In the 1950s, as a Senate wife, she very naturally, on the face of it, assumed the role of wife and mother and hostess. And as she met and came to know the political circles of Senator Kennedy, she, of course, her own circles of friends grew, and she began to meet others who perhaps she realized did not live, eat, and sleep politics all day. One of those people was Arthur Schlesinger. She began in the 1950s with him a lifelong friendship. And he, better than anyone, I think, summarized Jacqueline Kennedy's political, artistic, intellectual sensibilities and how they seemed rather submerged, almost like an iceberg, that we only saw the tip of the person. Underneath a veil of lovely inconsequence, Arthur Schlesinger wrote, she concealed tremendous awareness, an all-seeing eye, and a ruthless judgment. During the 1960 campaign, although she very carefully avoided controversial issues, it has also been a gross misunderstanding of the facts to assume that she never discussed the issues. On several issues, in fact, she felt quite strongly, and one of them was on increased education. I agree education is primarily a local responsibility, she said, but it does seem imperative that the federal government step in and do its share. More teachers must be trained, but paid more so that they will enter the professions. On Medicare, the aged shouldn't be put in the indignant position of swearing that they are in need of medical care. It's a problem for many women of middle years because so many of them are faced with the need for taking care of their own children. College education for their children could mean leaving their parents stranded. A terrible, frightening decade is ahead. People are too complacent about this country's power. Somebody has to talk to the Russians. That, a more oblique reference, of course, to the nuclear threat hanging over this country and the Soviet Union, over all the world during the Cold War years. That would become, interestingly enough, an important political theme for her that she always saw in human terms. From the onset, she said what she did and did not want to do as First Lady. I didn't want to go down into coal mines or be a symbol of elegance. As soon as Jack ran for president, I decided that if he were elected, I would make restoring the White House my project. I hope that when I leave here, I will have done something to help the arts. Whoever lives in the White House must preserve its traditions, enhance it, and leave something of herself there. Every First Lady should do something in this position to help the things she cared about. Jackie's role model as First Lady, interestingly, was not one of her predecessors. It was really Thomas Jefferson. She loved Jefferson. She read not only biographies of Jefferson, but most of his published works. As she said at the time, I wish I could be married to Thomas Jefferson because he would know what best should be done. I'd like to have studied architecture like Jefferson. Now there was a man. He could do so many things. Jefferson is the president with whom I have the most affinity. And today, if you have a chance later to look in the Blue Room, you will see in there the proudest acquisition that came during her restoration of the White House. It is the Rembrandt Peale portrait of Jefferson, given by her friends, the Paul Mellons. She found that it was the most lifelike and energetic portrait. More of a Greek, as she described him, rather than a Roman like George Washington. The facts are there, and they are many, and I can only, in this time, pay justice to them by reciting some of them to you. But when you look at the list of accomplishments in just 3 years in the White House, it is truly extraordinary what Jacqueline Kennedy was able to achieve. She helped establish the White House Historical Association, which is still in place today. That allows for this house to continue to acquire historical items for the upkeep of the room and the continuation of an education program through the publications of its books and publications. She established the role of curator. She began gathering items associated with past presidents for rooms, not just of the late 17th century and early 18th century quality of this state floor, but the Lincoln Suite upstairs and the Treaty Room upstairs, which were in Victorian, which were not her personal favorites, but she felt the great need and the importance of gathering all such items. She, of course, gave her famous television tour of the White House, wrote, finally, her book, the very first of the White House historical books, The White House, an Historical Guide, still in print, raising funds for continuing restoration. Historic preservation. She not only helped to save Lafayette Square, working with architect John Carl Warnecke, who was here with us this afternoon. She wrote JFK a detailed memo on why United States funds should be used to help save the threatened Egyptian temples on the Nile. She had the Jefferson Memorial floodlit. She prompted the first renovation of Blair House. She stopped a planned bridge over the Potomac. She wanted the old post office and 19th century hotels preserved during the redevelopment of Pennsylvania Avenue. She even reviewed architectural plans for federal office buildings, post offices, and courthouses. We must begin to see Jacqueline Kennedy as a multi-dimensional person, which is not to take away from her clothing style or her entertaining style, but merely to complement it. Complement that with her very specific and large vision for the American arts and her subtle yet constant political skills. All the style that we attribute to Jacqueline Kennedy for so many years of her life sprang from a deep substance. She represented, said Arthur Schlesinger, all at once not a negation of her country, but a possible fulfillment of it, a dream of civilization and beauty, a suggestion that America was not to be trapped forever in the bourgeois ideal. Now, as far as the arts, she did begin to become a little bit more political, or what we might label as political. As far as she was concerned, it was just an extension of her passion for the arts. During a musicians' union strike at the Metropolitan Opera, she encouraged Labor Secretary Goldberg to try and help negotiate it. She encouraged public institutions ranging from the new Arkansas Art Center to the first Shakespeare in the Parks in Central Park. She helped the fledgling Washington Gallery of Modern Art become established. She painted her own watercolor drawings for Christmas cards, which were sold to raise money for the first National Cultural Center, later, of course, to be named for the president, the Kennedy Center. She used the White House as a showcase, not only of the finest talents, but for the first time invited some of the greatest contemporary artists to the White House, who had never been honored there before. People like Grace Brumbry, abstract painters Mark Rothko and Franz Klein, poets St. John Perse and Robert Lowell, writer Saul Bellow, Thornton Wilder, Patty Chayefsky, playwrights S.N. Berman and Arthur Miller. She formed friendships, personal friendships, with many artists, but perhaps the greatest influence on how she recognized a bridge between government and the arts was through her friendship with André Malraux, the great French patriot and poet, and at the time, the Minister of Culture in the de Gaulle cabinet. In 1987, during the preparation of the First Lady's books, Mrs. Onassis very discreetly cooperated with me in the preparation of material for that book, and at the time gave me what I consider a rather remarkable admission, although it was some 30 years late and we sort of knew it. she sort of came on the record about her vision for the arts in this country. President Kennedy and I shared the conviction that the artists should be honored by society, and that all of this had to do with calling attention to what was finest in America, what should be esteemed in honors. The arts had been treated as a stepchild in the United States. When the government had supported the arts, as in many WPA projects, artists were given a hand, and some wonderful things emerged. It had been seen in Europe how proud those countries were of their arts and artists. Of course, they had a longer tradition of patronage going back to kings, popes, princes, but modern governments continued the support. Our great museums and great performance companies should of course be supported, but the experimental and unknown should also be thrown a line. Our contemporary artists in all the media have excited the world. It was sad that we, the United States, couldn't help them more. The public, however, had to feel the need for the support of the arts. You couldn't just jump in and name a czar. I hoped one day to have a minister for the arts in the cabinet, but much groundwork would have to be done before it could be possible. August Heckscher was appointed as the very first arts advisor to a president. And after he departed, there was a couple of months there where it lagged. It was not certainly a priority with the president's advisors in negotiations, for example, on the Hill with his education bill. But by November 1963, it was back on track. And Richard Goodwin, presidential advisor and a very close friend of Mrs. Kennedy's, was to be appointed to that position. It never happened. It, of course, was an order in the president's briefcase on his way to Texas. But she did feel later on that the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities did achieve some of what she hoped a government department would. She wouldn't testify on Capitol Hill on behalf of the arts. After all, she said, "I'm not Mrs. Roosevelt." With great gross understatement, she said that. If she didn't lobby Congress, however, she was highly political in her sensibilities. By most accounts, by all accounts, during the Bay of Pigs, she provided a tremendous emotional comfort to the president. And during the nuclear missile crisis, she was informed by the president of every move. And in fact, he wanted her to take the children and leave, to go out into Virginia to a shelter, and she refused to leave the president and refused to leave the White House. As Dr. Janet Travell, the president's doctor, said at the time, perhaps no one else saw that rare demonstration of affection when they were walking on the lawn and holding each other. A few days later, as the public learned of the crisis, I thought of its deep significance, the unbreakable bond of love between them that showed clearest in times of trouble. In personal ways, Jacqueline Kennedy revealed her views on controversial social issues of the day. Now, she didn't hold a press conference on her views on integration in the public schools. Instead, when she created the kindergarten upstairs at the White House for her daughter Caroline, she also invited the young son of the Assistant Press Secretary, Andrew Hatcher, who happened to be African American, to join the group. In one fell swoop, the White House school had been integrated. She formed personal friendships, not political friendships per se, but personal friendships with de Gaulle and Nehru and Colombia's President Camargo, not unlike the atmosphere created by Mrs. Reagan for the Gorbachev friendship, the personal friendship between Gorbachev and President Reagan. As Charlotte Curtis said at the time, Jacqueline Kennedy represents an effort to understand foreign people in a country that tends to think it is the only country, and that English is the only language. She stands for a sensitivity to art and beauty, despite pragmatic politics, nuclear tests, and the Cold War. She is one of the few independent spirits left in an age of conformity. Although I might add that she did lobby Senator Clint Anderson of New Mexico at tea in the Red Room for a congressional bill, later known as Jackie's Bill, which permitted the property of the White House to become the inalienable and permanent material in this house, whereas before it had been permitted to be auctioned off. She was, of course, both preserving and making history herself, making history almost trendy or chic. Television, of course, made the great difference there. She came to the White House at a time where all sorts of outside factors were converging. A disposable income, a growing middle class, and of course, as I say, the television. She, by giving her tour of the White House, opened it up for millions of people who would never otherwise been able to see it, not only in this country, but across the world. The USIA translated her tour of the White House into many foreign languages. And of course, she hired the first press secretary, an institution that has been with us since then. The First Lady's role was at that time, in many ways, because of television, radically thrust into the modern age. Ultimately, it was her sense of history, both in copying the Lincoln funeral, yet with the knowledge that it would be broadcast and preserved footage forever, which led to her instinctive decisions and behavior during the internationally televised events following Dallas. As Joseph Campbell assessed in The Power of Myth, the Kennedy funeral was a ritualized occasion of the greatest social necessity, which reestablished the sense of solidarity. Here was an enormous nation, made those 4 days into a unanimous community, all of us participating in the same way, simultaneously in a single symbolic event. Such images line the walls of our interior systems of belief like shards of broken pottery in an archaeological dig site. The editor of that book was Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. We think of her most persistently from that glorious White House era, but to her, as a real person, those were only 3 years out of a 64-year life. Perhaps we and the media and our focus on her never left that era in our perceptions of her, but she moved on, and quickly. As far as she was concerned, except for occasional events to memorialize the president on behalf of the Kennedy Library, her life was no longer a public one, and she made every attempt to live her own life as she defined it, despite pressure and advice from her mother, her family, her close friends, political associates of the president, her in-laws, the press, the public. She kept her own sanity. She kept her own sense of proportion and balance by sticking to the things she valued and she defined as important to her. Yet even in her greatly misunderstood marriage to Onassis, who had been, by the way, an acquaintance of Senator Kennedy and both of his parents, Rose and Joe Kennedy, she kept to her interests, helping, for example, to preserve an ancient marketplace at the foot of the Acropolis. Why do people always try and see me through the different names I have had at different times? People forget I was first Jacqueline Bouvier before becoming Mrs. Kennedy or Mrs. Onassis. Despite protests from Onassis, she began writing again in the mid-1970s, a piece for The New Yorker, and afterwards to Peter Beard's book, Longing for Darkness, Camonte's Tales from Out of Africa, about the friendship of a native Nairobian and Isaac Dinesen. As she wrote, the book recalls the immediacy of Dinesen's philosophy for today's young people, who are so persistently idealistic, so ready to be martyrs, to show them that they had allies in an earlier time, who knew that courage was endurance as well as abandon. Today, everything is about to happen. But about can mean a generation, not the next 6 months. That is where the courage of endurance comes in. Black people here, as well as in Africa, know what endurance means. Well, her endurance certainly paid off. After her second widowhood, with her children grown, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, at the age of 46 years old, went back to work, taking a job that was occupied by and large by 26-year-olds. She started on the low rung of the totem pole in publishing as an editor, and it began what she called the happiest time of my life. She developed a greater sense of her own feminism, an appreciation and sensitivity to people perhaps in her walk of life she had not previously met, who had to work. And she also felt strongly about work as a form of happiness. That, as she said, women should work because they should do something they enjoy. That's the definition of happiness: complete use of one's faculties along the lines leading to excellence in a life affording them scope. This applies to women as well as to men. We can't all reach it, but we try to carry it, but we can try to reach it in some degree. And she even became more public, actually coming down here to Washington, lobbying public support during a Supreme Court decision affecting historic preservation law. In the later part of her life, she came to terms, I think, with her own place in history. She had been socialized, of course, as a young woman to always place her husband first. And so you find many examples of her sort of almost being shy or embarrassed about taking credit on behalf of different historic preservation efforts. But later on, I think, within a circle of friends at the publishing company and others who she came to trust, little by little, she sort of came out of her shell and began to value, I think, those contributions that she made. She also came to understand and appreciate the unique role she had as a First Lady. For example, she was very fond of Pat Nixon, wrote a very moving letter to Mrs. Nixon, who arranged for a private dinner here, the first and only time Jacqueline Kennedy returned to the White House, for the unveiling of the portraits posthumously done of President Kennedy and of herself. Later, when Mrs. Nixon was dying of cancer, Jacqueline Kennedy wrote her a letter talking about their years together as Senate wives and the '60 campaign. After the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan, she phoned and wrote and comforted Nancy Reagan. And she really loved Hillary Clinton. She, I think, found in Mrs. Clinton a kind of, I hope you don't mind me saying this, and I want to embarrass you, but I think, found in her a similar spirit. She found in her a woman who was willing to do what she wanted to do in interpreting her choices, not only for her own life, but for the public role of First Lady. I think she would have very much appreciated and loved the sculpture garden that Mrs. Clinton has installed, the contemporary crafts that have been displayed here, the Blue Room, the Lincoln Room sitting room, the Treaty Room restorations. And she gave her advice. She told her, it's wonderful to learn about what your predecessors have done here, but you must follow your own drum. You must do what comes naturally and best to you. And really, when you look through history, that is oftentimes the best advice one First Lady has given another, since this role has no constitutional definition. She was also discreetly willing and interested in helping writers and scholars, journalists, in their attempts to evaluate her legacy. As she said, maybe now people will realize that there was something beneath the pillbox hat. She also had, and I conclude with, an enduring kind of relationship with Lady Bird Johnson. Through all the many things that they went together, their husbands being colleagues in the Senate in the 50s and the 1960 primary race against each other, sharing the second billing on the 1960 Democratic ticket, and then, of course, the trip to Texas. Mrs. Johnson was up on Martha's Vineyard in 1993 in the summer, and she recalled that last summer we came to each other again. She invited me for Sunday lunch. Her house was down off the main road, a winding road, a countryside type of place in tune with the ocean so close by. We ate under an arbor of vines, the sea, across the sand dunes and grasses, murmuring out below. We talked of authors and books coming across her desk and into her life, and the children, now grown of course. We did not reminisce about the past. In all of that, and looking back and remembering now, I have a feeling of ineffable sadness. She had just reached this quiet harbor of doing things she had wanted to do and being with people she wanted to do them with, and then life came to an end. And so we are left still with this very strong image of the chic woman who entertained lovely and well and dressed well and had wonderful manners. But it is time, I believe, to really open our definitions and not try to place people perhaps in this sort of American pantheon, if you will, putting different people on pedestals and ascribing to them and transferring to them all that we want them to be, rather than seeing them for the multidimensional people that they are, as we all are. In some ways, beyond the material legacy she left us here in Washington and around the nation, she also left us, I think, a legacy how to live life as art. One story comes to mind that was told to me by her assistant Bruce Tracy, who worked with her at Doubleday. He had never before been to Europe, and they had just worked very hard, exhaustively, on a book. It was about Russian history. There was going to be a party at the Russian tea room, and yet he had this opportunity to go to Europe. He had never been there before, and he was very embarrassed, and he went to talk to Jackie about it. And he told her, and she said, "Of course you go. Life comes first." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carl, and I want to thank everyone who is here today who cooperated with Carl in giving us this expanded and wonderful view of Jackie Kennedy Onassis. And now I invite you to join us in the State Dining Room for a reception, and you can ask Carl all the questions that you would like to and have a chance to visit with one another. Thank you for coming.